Snow whirled through the
Please,
dark
Lord, let
Boston
them
night
survive
as a
the
terrified
night.
young maid clutched two dying
Keep
puppies in
them
her
warm
arms,
and safe in
thrown
your
out into the
care.
storm by the cruel hands of her wealthy
Please,
employers.
Lord, let them
Her
survive the
tears froze
night.
before they fell, and she
Keep them
whispered,
warm and safe
"Please,
in your
God,
care.
don't let them die." But God had already sent help. A young Marine and his loyal German Shepherd were driving through the blizzard when the dog suddenly growled, sensing danger. Moments later, they found her shivering on the icy steps, barely alive. What began as a rescue soon uncovered a dark secret. A powerful family breeding dogs for profit, a city blinded by corruption, and one Marine's vow to protect the innocent no matter the cost. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to join our family of stories. Snow had swallowed Boston whole, the Charles River buried under a howling white silence that felt endless. The Hale mansion stood proud against the storm, its tall windows glowing faintly through the curtain of snow. Inside, warmth and laughter spilled from the ballroom, where the city's most polished philanthropists celebrated their own generosity, their crystal glasses clinking like brittle icicles. Yet 3 floors above that glittering display, a girl moved through shadows. Grace Walker was 19, small-framed and quiet, the kind of presence that servants forgot were in the room.
Word of this,
Her hair,
you
a
will
muted
regret
chestnut,
it for the
framed a
rest
face
of
too
your
pale from
miserable
years spent
life.
beneath other people's roofs. Her gray eyes were steady, not empty, the color of Boston's winter sky, heavy with stories no one cared to read. She had come to the Hale estate 2 years earlier, an orphan of the foster system, grateful for a paycheck and a roof that didn't leak. But gratitude had its limits. Tonight, fear beat faster than gratitude. She knelt before the medicine cabinet in the mansion's silent staff kitchen. Her fingers trembled so violently that the small glass bottles inside clinked together, betraying her. "Please," she whispered to no one, her breath fogging in the cold air. The furnace never reached this part of the house. Her maid's uniform hung loose from her narrow shoulders. She found what she'd been searching for, a half-empty bottle of pediatric antibiotics, and tucked it carefully into her apron beside a can of imported baby formula. They weren't for her. They were for the 2 small lives hidden in a cardboard box beneath the attic cot where she slept. Scout and Ember. German Shepherd pups, 6 weeks old and barely breathing. Their fur was patchy, their ribs visible under skin too thin to hold warmth. They were the defects of the Hale breeding program. Dogs bred for rich collectors, but born imperfect. Grace had overheard Richard Hale's voice that morning, gravelly and cold, instructing the groundskeeper, "Handle them in the morning. Use the pond." She'd felt the blood drain from her hands. Richard Hale, 65, was a man built like a retired boxer. Broad shoulders, white hair neatly parted, face carved from granite. His wealth came from silence and cruelty disguised as elegance. There was something in his eyes, an old meanness sharpened by time, that saw no life as sacred unless it carried a pedigree. His wife, Victoria, carried that same sharpness in a more refined shell. Tall, silver-haired, regal, draped in jewels that glittered like the frost outside. Her face was smooth for 60, but her smile never reached her eyes. She treated her servants with the same detached politeness she gave the chandeliers. Useful, but invisible. Grace clutched the medicine to her chest and hurried up the servants' stairwell, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. The muffled hum of the ballroom faded, replaced by the low groan of the storm pressing against the old house. She reached the attic and exhaled, closing the door quietly behind her. The little box sat beside her bed. Scout lifted his head weakly, eyes milky with fever, while Ember made a sound that was almost a sigh. "Hold on," Grace whispered. She used an old syringe to measure the antibiotics, mixing the dose with the formula she'd warmed between her hands. The smell of milk filled the cold air. When Scout took the first sip, his tail flicked once. Hope was fragile, but it was there. Grace smiled through tears she didn't realize had fallen. "You're going to make it," she said, her voice trembling with faith she didn't fully believe. The sound of a door slamming downstairs made her freeze. Footsteps echoed through the stairwell, sharp, deliberate, coming closer. She barely had time to hide the bottle under her cot before the attic door burst open. Victoria Hale filled the doorway like a shadow sculpted in emerald silk. Her gown shimmered even in the dim light, the diamonds at her throat catching the flicker of a single attic bulb. Her face was a study in cold perfection, but her eyes, blue and cutting, were far worse. "What are you hiding, girl?" The words were silk over steel. Grace stammered, "Ma'am, Don't lie to me." Victoria stepped closer. The scent of her perfume, expensive and suffocating, filled the room. "Empty your pockets." Grace's fingers shook as she obeyed. The can of baby formula rolled across the floor. The bottle of antibiotics clinked beside it. Victoria's lips curved into a smile that wasn't a smile. "Stealing from my grandchild. How poetic. You'll be out by morning." "It wasn't for me," Grace pleaded, her voice breaking. "It's for the puppies, Scout and Ember. They're sick. Please, they'll die without—" The mention of the dogs changed everything. Victoria's expression hardened to stone. "You dare speak of that filthy business in my house?" Grace took a step back. "Please, ma'am, I'll work for free. You'll be silent." Victoria grabbed her arm. For a woman her age, her grip was surprisingly strong, the kind that came from a lifetime of control. She dragged Grace down the stairs. Grace stumbled, her slippers slipping on the polished wood. "Please, you're hurting me." "I intend to," Victoria hissed. They emerged into the grand foyer. The music faltered as the guests turned. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in cruel light. Dozens of well-dressed men and women stared, their champagne glasses hovering mid-air. "My apologies," Victoria said loudly, her tone practiced and theatrical. "It seems we've harbored a thief." She shook Grace's arm for emphasis. This ungrateful girl was caught stealing medicine meant for my infant grandchild. A murmur spread through the crowd. Gasps, whispers, judgment. Grace's face burned. She tried to speak, but her throat closed around the upturned words. "Please, it's not what you think. It's for the puppies." "Puppies?" Victoria laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. Delusional as well as dishonest. She turned to the footman. "Bring the box from her room. Now." "No, please," Grace cried, struggling against Victoria's grip. Moments later, the footman appeared, pale and nervous, carrying the cardboard box. The faint wheeze of the puppies echoed through the grand hall. Victoria snatched the box and strode to the open front door. The cold wind burst in, scattering the guests' murmurs into silence. Without a word, she hurled the box down the marble steps. A small yelp sliced through the night air. "Now you can join them," Victoria said, her voice like ice. She grabbed Grace's threadbare satchel from the closet and threw it after her. "You're finished here. You'll never work in this city again." The door slammed. The sound of the lock was final, echoing through the storm. Grace fell to her knees, the wind slashing her skin. She crawled to the box, shielding the trembling puppies under her apron. "It's okay," she whispered, voice shaking. We'll make it somehow. The snow swallowed her words, but not her will. Somewhere beneath the storm, she still believed in kindness. Somewhere, she still believed someone would hear their cry. The storm had not eased when Daniel Miller saw her. His truck tires hissed against a skin of slush as the headlights cut through a blur of white and shadow. It was past midnight, and Boston had turned ghostly under the weight of the blizzard. Daniel, or Dan as his fellow Marines called him, was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, disciplined to the bone, with the kind of quiet that came from years of war and silence. His jawline was sharp beneath a trace of stubble, and a thin scar ran from his temple to the edge of his cheek, a souvenir from a desert night half a world away. His dark blonde hair was cropped short, regulation neat, but his eyes, gray-blue and steady, held a restlessness that peace could not quiet. Atlas, his German shepherd, stirred beside him in the passenger seat. The old war dog, 8 years into a life that had seen too much, lifted his massive head. His coat was a thick, dark sable streaked with silver at the muzzle. His ears twitched forward, his muscles tense. Then came that sound, a low, vibrating growl from deep in his chest. It wasn't aggression. It was instinct. Warning. "What is it, boy?" Dan murmured, his hand brushing the dog's shoulder, feeling the tremor of readiness. He eased off the accelerator, his headlights sweeping over the iron gates of the Hale estate. There, at the base of a stone pillar half buried in snow, something moved. A girl. She was kneeling, barely upright, a shape of shivering limbs and soaked cloth. In her arms, 2 small bundles pressed close against her chest. Even from inside the truck, Dan could see how violently she trembled. He stopped the engine, opened the door, and stepped into the storm. The cold bit into him, a sharp reminder of the war zones where survival depended on ignoring pain. He moved fast, purposeful, his heavy boots sinking into the snow. Atlas leapt down after him, a dark blur in the swirling white. The dog padded ahead, nose down, then slowed, lowering his head beside the girl. Grace lifted her face. Her lips were blue, her lashes stuck together with frozen tears. "Please, they're dying," she whispered. Her voice was thin, breaking under the wind. Dan saw the 2 tiny forms, a pair of German shepherd pups barely breathing. He crouched beside her. "Let's get them warm first," he said, voice low, calm, certain. There was something in the tone, authority without cruelty, that made Grace obey instantly. He stripped off his thick M65 jacket and wrapped it around her and the puppies. "My truck's right there," he said, gesturing to the faint outline of the vehicle through the storm. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly, but her knees gave out when she tried to stand. Atlas pressed his shoulder against her leg, steadying her like a living crutch. For the first time that night, Dan smiled, faint and fleeting. "That's my partner. He's better at this than I am." Inside the truck, the heater blasted against the icy air. Grace huddled in, the passenger seat, the pups tucked in her lap under Dan's coat. Atlas sat alert behind them, his watchful eyes fixed on her movements, but his expression soft, protective. "Hold on, kid," Dan muttered, gripping the wheel. He drove fast, steady through the unplowed streets of South Boston, the truck's engine growling like an old marine's sigh. The city outside was a frozen wasteland, dark storefronts, buried cars, the occasional flicker of blue from a police cruiser lost in the storm. Grace's breathing was ragged. "They'll die, won't they?" she asked suddenly, staring at the puppies. "Not if we do something about it," Dan said. "I've seen worse come back." "Who are you?" she whispered. He hesitated, eyes on the road. Name's Dan Miller, U.S. Marine Corps, and that's Atlas. He nodded toward the back seat. He's retired, technically. Doesn't believe in it, though. Atlas gave a short huff, as if agreeing. Grace almost smiled. Almost. The drive ended at a brick apartment building, plain, square, and unremarkable. Dan's home looked more like a supply depot than a living space. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal. A single photograph of a Marine unit in Afghanistan sat on a shelf beside a folded flag. The air smelled faintly of gun oil and coffee. Dan guided Grace to the couch. "Sit," he said, moving with the precision of habit. He opened a metal field case, his medical kit, military issue, and pulled out an IV bag, sterile needles, bandages. His hands were steady, his movements efficient but careful. He had patched up men bleeding out in deserts. This was delicate work, but not foreign. Grace watched him, dazed. "You're a soldier." "Marine," he corrected softly, attaching the line to the bag. "We don't like to be called soldiers." "Sorry," she whispered. He glanced at her, and something in her eyes, fear mixed with gratitude, pulled at a part of him he thought the battlefield had burned away. "No need to be sorry. You did the right thing." She blinked. "For stealing?" "For saving," he said simply. He injected the fluid beneath Scout's loose skin, then turned to Ember, who whimpered faintly. The heater hummed. Atlas exhaled deeply, and for a few moments the room was filled only with the soft rhythm of survival. Grace sipped the mug of hot tea he handed her. Her hands shook so badly that some of it spilled, but the warmth seemed to bring color back to her cheeks. She stared into the steam. They were going to kill them, said they were worthless. Dan's jaw tightened. People like that think life's a business transaction. They've never had to fight for it. Grace looked up at him. "And you?" He met her gaze evenly. "I've fought enough to know what's worth saving." A silence fell. Outside, the storm screamed against the windows. Inside, the pup's breathing grew steadier. Atlas shifted closer, resting his head near Grace's knees, his golden eyes soft but alert. She reached down hesitantly, brushing her fingers through his fur. "You're a good boy," she whispered. Dan smiled slightly. "He knows it. That's the problem." A faint laugh escaped her, a fragile sound, but real. Hours passed. The wind began to fade, the storm losing strength. Dan threw another blanket over Grace's shoulders. "Get some rest. You're safe now." She looked at him, uncertain. "Why are you helping me?" He paused, hand resting on the back of the couch. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it," he said. "I guess I owe the world one." He didn't elaborate, but the memory in his eyes was unmistakable. Of a dusty road, a friend's voice gone forever, a promise made in blood. Grace didn't ask again. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, Dan sat by the window, watching the first gray hint of dawn break through the storm. Atlas rested at his feet, breathing slow, his tail thumping once. Dan looked at the girl and the two tiny dogs bundled beside her. "Looks like we've got company, buddy," he murmured. Atlas answered with a low rumble that wasn't a warning this time, just agreement. Outside, Boston was still buried in white. But inside that small apartment, something had shifted. A quiet alliance formed in the heart of a winter storm. The street outside Beacon Hill Emergency Veterinary Clinic was drowned in white. Snow piled against the curb like waves of frozen surf, the lamplight glinting faintly across the windshield of Dan's truck. Inside, Scout lay limp in Grace's trembling arms, the little German shepherd's chest shuddering with each ragged breath. Dan drove through the storm without a word. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked forward, the faint scar on his cheek catching the reflection of passing headlights. Atlas sat alert behind him, his ears pinned forward, muscles tense, an instinct that had never left him from his years in uniform. The clinic doors swung open before Dan even stopped the engine. A woman in her late 30s stepped out, her posture brisk and her face pale in the fluorescent glow. Dr. Amanda Evans was tall and lean, with sharp features softened by exhaustion. Her light brown hair was pulled into a loose bun, wisps escaping to frame a face lined not by vanity, but by sleepless nights. She was one of those people who had long ago chosen compassion over comfort, and the weight of that choice showed in the faint tremor of her hands. "Inside, quickly!" she ordered, holding the door as Dan strode through. He placed Scout on the stainless steel exam table. "Seizures started 15 minutes ago," he said, his voice clipped, efficient. "Weak pulse, cyanotic gums, advanced pneumonia. We stabilized him with fluids." Evans nodded once. "Good call." She moved with practiced speed, attaching oxygen tubes, calling for a tech. A young man in blue scrubs, Ben, according to his badge, appeared at her side, his movements hesitant but eager to please. Grace hovered near the door, clutching Ember close. Her clothes were still damp from the storm, her cheeks blotched red from the cold and fear. She felt invisible in the sterile brightness, her small frame dwarfed by machines and uniforms. When Dr. Evans glanced at her, it was with quick sympathy. "You're the owner?" Grace shook her head. "No, She saved them," Dan said simply. That was all, no explanation. His tone made the rest unnecessary. Evans didn't press. She turned back to her patient, her voice firm. "We'll do everything we can." 15 minutes later, Scout was under sedation and hooked to an oxygen tent. Evans peeled off her gloves, exhaled, and nodded to Ben. "Keep him stable. If his temp spikes, I want you to cool him slowly, not all at once." Grace leaned against the counter, relief and dread tangled in her chest. Her fingers brushed Ember's fur, feeling the faint rise and fall of the tiny ribs. She whispered something under her breath, half prayer, half apology. "Sit down," Dan told her quietly. She obeyed, too drained to argue. He turned to the vet. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Evans replied. "He's fighting, but it's bad. The lungs are compromised." Grace's throat closed. "He'll make it," she said softly, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Evans gave her a tired smile. "We'll try." Needing a moment, Grace excused herself to the restroom. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and winter air. She was washing her hands, watching the pale reflection in the mirror, when she heard voices through the thin wall of the adjoining office. One voice was low and cold, the kind of voice that never begged, only ordered. "Dispose of the animals, quietly, and the girl, label her unstable, maybe exposed to rabies. She disappears tonight." Grace froze. Her pulse spiked. She pressed closer to the door. Dr. Evans's voice answered, strained. "Mr. Benson, I'm not part of whatever this is. They're sick animals. I can't." "Can't?" The man's tone turned silken, dangerous. "You'll do it. Marcus Hale doesn't appreciate loose ends. The Thorns donation to this clinic covers your mortgage, doesn't it? It would be a shame to lose that." Grace's blood turned to ice. She recognized the name, Mr. Benson, the Hale family lawyer. She backed away, hand over her mouth, then bolted from the hall. When she burst into the exam room, her face was ashen. "They're trying to kill them," she gasped. He's here. The lawyer from the mansion. He told her to let Scout die. Evans turned white. Dan straightened slowly, his shoulders squaring. His voice was calm, but the kind of calm that came just before a storm. Where is he? The office, Grace whispered. Dan didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked at Evans. You're going to do your job. Save the dog. Nothing else. His tone was flat, military, unarguable. Understand? Evans nodded, her eyes wide. Then Dan stepped into the hallway. Mr. Benson was exactly the kind of man Dan expected. Mid-50s, expensive wool coat, a silk scarf tied neatly at his throat. His hair was silver and perfectly combed, but his eyes were small and slick, the color of wet stone. His smile was the kind that cost other people money. He turned as Dan entered, irritation flickering at the interruption. This is a private... Not anymore, Dan said. Who are you? Someone who doesn't like bullies. Benson's smile returned, thinner. You don't know who you're interfering with. I don't care, Dan replied. You're leaving. Now. Benson hesitated. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by a man built like a storm wall. Dan stepped closer, the air between them shrinking. The Marine didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His presence did the talking. I said now. Something in Benson's instincts told him this was not a man who bluffed. He adjusted his scarf and brushed past, muttering, You'll regret this. I doubt it, Dan murmured. Back in the exam room, Grace sat trembling, tears streaking her cheeks. Evans, pale but composed, returned to Scout's side. He's still with us, she said softly. Dan nodded once. Good. Keep it that way. Moments later, the glass door of the clinic slammed. Benson was gone into the storm. By dawn, Scout's breathing had steadied, the oxygen tent misting faintly with each small exhale. Evans handed Dan a portable tank and a set of instructions. He needs constant warmth. Don't let him get cold again. Come back tomorrow for a checkup. Dan thanked her with a firm handshake. Grace, exhausted but alert, clutched the small carrier that held the two puppies. Atlas padded beside them as they stepped out into the gray light of morning. The storm had ended, but Boston looked stripped bare, streets glazed in ice, the city hushed as if holding its breath. They drove back to Southie in silence. When they reached Dan's apartment, another vehicle was already parked nearby, a dark SUV with government plates. Inside waited a man in his early 30s with calm eyes behind rectangular glasses. Ethan Brooks was Dan's oldest friend from the Corps, a Marine intelligence officer turned systems analyst. He was taller than Dan, leaner with a permanent air of calculation, like someone who could hear danger before it arrived. His short black hair was neatly parted, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal a tattoo of a compass on his forearm. You picked up trouble again, Ethan said dryly, glancing at Grace and the dogs. Same kind of trouble, Dan answered. Within minutes, Ethan had his laptop open, the screen glowing blue. The name Hale keeps popping up in off-the-books transactions. Cash routes through a shelter in Milton, ties to a police captain named Roy Carter. Dirty money, Dan? Deep pockets. Dan's eyes narrowed. That's who sent them. Ethan nodded. And they'll come again. Grace looked between them, terrified. What do we do? Dan reached down, scratching Atlas behind the ear. We make sure we're ready. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Inside the apartment, the faint hiss of the oxygen tank filled the silence. The city might have been waking up, but for them, the night had only just begun. The morning after the storm, Boston was quiet. The snow that had raged through the night now lay still, blanketing the city like a burial shroud. In Dan Miller's small apartment, the hum of an oxygen tank and the soft snore of Atlas filled the air. The German Shepherd had claimed his post by the front door, his massive frame blocking the draft, while Grace sat curled on the couch, a blanket draped around her shoulders. Scout and Ember slept in a crate near the heater, their tiny chests rising and falling in rhythm with the warmth. Ethan Brooks sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open, blue light reflecting off his glasses. The faint tapping of keys broke the silence. His sharp features were illuminated by the screen, high cheekbones, a jaw that always looked like it had something to prove, and eyes that carried the perpetual exhaustion of a man who'd seen too much data and too little daylight. He had once been a Marine intelligence officer in Kandahar, where decisions were made not by bullets, but by information. That experience had carved into him a habit of thinking 5 steps ahead and never trusting coincidence. Dan poured himself a mug of black coffee, the smell mixing with the faint metallic tang of disinfectant. "Anything?" he asked. Ethan's fingers didn't stop moving. "Enough to get the feds interested." He spun the laptop toward Dan. On the screen were scanned pages, handwritten ledgers, receipts, bank transfers. Grace's stolen photos had become their smoking gun. Every payment line matches a date in the city shelter records. Marcus Hale's kennel in Milton wasn't just breeding dogs. He was running an underground supply ring, illegal trading, tax evasion, animal cruelty. And this name, Captain Roy Carter, Boston PD, his community fund, shows deposits from the same account. Grace looked up from the couch, eyes wide. "He's the one who came to the door." "Yeah," Ethan said. "The one who's supposed to protect people like you. Turns out he's protecting their money." Dan leaned against the counter, arms folded, his expression grim. "So what's next?" "I've already reached out to someone," Ethan replied. "FBI Special Agent Mark Sandoval, Organized Crime and Animal Welfare Division. He's old school, spent 20 years working cases that never made the news. Guy's got a reputation for patience and the kind of anger that doesn't fade." A video window opened on the screen. The face that appeared belonged to Mark Sandoval, a man in his late 40s, olive-skinned with lines etched deep around his eyes. His hair was peppered gray, and his gaze carried the steady weight of someone who had seen humanity at its worst and still got up every morning to fight it. His voice was gravelly, deliberate. "Mr. Brooks," he said, nodding. "You're not exaggerating. This is bad. You've got enough here to bury a few people." Ethan smirked. "I was hoping you'd say that," Sandoval continued. "I can authorize a federal warrant. We'll move fast, before your friends in Boston PD try to clean up. I'll need an address for the Milton property." Dan spoke for the first time, stepping into view of the camera. "It's a large estate near the edge of the Blue Hills. High walls, steel gate. There's a kennel building behind the main house." Sandoval studied him. "You're military." "Marine Corps." The agent nodded slightly. "Good. Then you know what we're walking into." He ended the call with a single line. "We move within the hour." An hour later, snow began falling again, light and steady, as though trying to hide the sins of the city beneath a clean white sheet. But inside Dan's apartment, tension hummed. Ethan monitored the live feed from his encrypted laptop, multiple drone views streaming in real time from the FBI's operation outside the Hale estate. Grace sat stiffly beside him, clutching her mug of cocoa with both hands, her fingers still trembling. From one feed, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up a long, icy driveway, Over the radio, Sandoval's voice was calm but firm. Teams 1 and 2 in position. Breach on my count. 3, 2, 1, go. The screen erupted in motion. Armed agents surged through the gate. The front door of the Hale mansion burst open under the force of a battering ram. Inside, the camera caught glimpses of luxury turned grotesque. Gold frames, marble floors, and a hallway lined with soundproofed kennels. Richard Hale stood frozen at the top of the staircase, his once perfect posture crumbling into shock. His wife, Victoria, clutched her silk robe around her, her face pale but proud, her chin lifted in defiance. "You can't come in here," she cried, but her voice was drowned out by the storm and the agent's commands. "FBI, hands where we can see them!" Handcuffs clicked like punctuation marks in a confession. Back in South Boston, Ethan closed his laptop. "It's done," he said softly. Grace's breath came out shaky. "They're arrested?" "Both of them," Ethan confirmed. "And Carter, too. Sandoval said he turned pale when they read him his rights." Dan sat on the couch beside her, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Grace." She shook her head. "No, it's not over." "Not really." Her eyes drifted toward the small crate near the heater. Scout stirred, letting out a weak, sleepy whine. Atlas, sensing the sound, got up, lumbered over, and nudged the oxygen tube closer to the puppy with his nose. Grace smiled through tears. "He's like an old doctor," she murmured. Dan chuckled softly. "A cranky one." For the first time in days, warmth filled the room, not from the heater, but from something human and fragile. Later that night, Dan brewed another pot of coffee while Ethan sat reviewing the final report. Grace was silent, watching the snow fall outside the window. Her reflection in the glass looked different, still tired, still uncertain, but stronger. Dan joined her by the window. "You know," he said quietly, "tomorrow, there'll be news vans, reporters, noise. Everyone will want a piece of this story. But when it all fades, when it gets quiet again, you'll still have to choose what comes next." Grace turned to him. "And what about you?" He smiled faintly. "Me? I'll go where I'm sent. It's what Marines do." "But you saved us," she said. Dan looked at her, his gray-blue eyes softening. "Maybe. But you started it, Grace. You chose to save something when everyone else walked away." The words settled between them like the falling snow, gentle, inevitable. Atlas, now curled by the door again, lifted his head briefly, watching them before letting out a long, satisfied sigh. The room fell quiet except for the rhythmic hum of life returning, paws shifting, the sound of breathing, the faint echo of a storm dying outside. In that silence, justice had walked its path through snow, not with sirens or guns, but with ordinary courage. A girl's defiance, a Marine's promise, a dog's unyielding faith. Winter loosened its grip on Boston slowly, like an old wound healing in stubborn silence. The streets that once groaned under mountains of snow now glistened with meltwater, and the Charles River breathed again beneath a fragile skin of ice. In every cafe and newsroom, the story of the Hale scandal lingered. Headlines still murmured about the arrests, the corruption, the cruelty buried under luxury. People read the news, shook their heads, and went back to their warm homes. But for those who had lived through it, the storm never really left. It only changed shape. Grace Walker stepped off the bus in Cambridge, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She was dressed simply: jeans, a faded green sweater, her brown hair tied in a loose ponytail. Her face had lost the frightened thinness of the attic girl. There was color now, a faint light in her gray eyes. She carried a canvas tote marked Second Chance Shepherd Rescue, the shelter where she had begun working 2 weeks earlier. The building itself was small, a converted brick warehouse tucked between an art studio and a used bookstore. Inside, it smelled of clean straw, soap, and dog fur. The shelter's owner, Helen Monroe, greeted Grace with a tired smile. Helen was in her 50s, broad-shouldered and practical, her once red hair streaked with gray and tied back in a braid. Years of animal rescue had left her hands rough but gentle, and her voice always carried a note of dry humor that softened even the harshest day. "You're early," Helen said, slipping off her gloves. "That's either dedication or insomnia." Grace smiled faintly. "A bit of both." Helen looked at her closely, the kind of look that saw more than it asked. "You're settling in fine here. The dogs like you. That's half the job." Grace nodded. Around them, the kennels stirred with the morning's rhythm, water bowls clinking, tails thumping against walls, the bark of excitement from a young shepherd pup learning patience. She moved from cage to cage, checking names written in neat handwriting on laminated tags. Daisy, Rex, Juno. Her hand paused at one tag, Bolt. The name reminded her too much of what had been lost and saved. In the back kennel, a familiar bark greeted her. "Ember!" Grace knelt, smiling as the little shepherd pressed her nose through the bars. Ember had grown stronger, sleek, alert, full of mischievous energy. The dog yipped in delight as another figure entered the shelter. Ethan Brooks, in civilian clothes that looked a size too formal for him, ducked through the doorway. His clean-cut hair and wireframe glasses made him look more like a professor than a Marine. He was carrying a leash in one hand, an awkward smile on his face. "She's still faster than I am," he said. Helen raised an eyebrow. "So you're the one adopting the troublemaker?" Ethan's grin deepened, shy but genuine. "Troublemaker's just another word for potential." Grace laughed softly. "You're sure you can handle her?" He knelt beside the kennel, and Ember wagged so hard her entire body wobbled. "I handled Dan Miller for 3 deployments," Ethan said. "I think I can manage a shepherd puppy." Helen chuckled and handed him the papers. "Sign there, Mr. Brooks, and try not to bring her back in a week." "Not a chance," Ethan said, his hand steady as he signed. "Every Marine needs a rookie." As Ember bounded out, tail high, the shelter seemed brighter. Grace stood at the door, watching them disappear into the thawing street, her chest full of quiet warmth. That evening, when the shelter lights dimmed and Helen locked up, Grace took a long walk home. Her apartment was small, just one room overlooking a narrow alley, but it was hers. She fed Scout, who had grown stronger, his coat shiny and his eyes clear. Atlas had been visiting often, sometimes with Dan, sometimes brought by Ethan on his way through the city. The old shepherd had taken to sleeping near Scout, like a mentor guarding his protege. Later that week, Dan came by the shelter for the first time since the investigation ended. He arrived in uniform, the dark green of the Marine Corps fitting him perfectly. His broad shoulders carried both authority and a kind of fatigue, the weight of someone always preparing to leave. His hair was freshly trimmed, his jaw clean-shaven, but the small scar on his cheek remained, catching the afternoon light like a signature. Helen noticed the man instantly, nudging Grace with a grin. "Now that is not your average volunteer," she whispered. Grace rolled her eyes, blushing faintly. "He's a friend." Dan's gaze softened when he saw her. "Hey, Walker," he greeted, using the old Marine habit of last names, though the teasing warmth in his voice betrayed affection. "You keeping them in line?" Grace smiled. "Trying to. Scout misses you." Dan crouched to pet the dog beside her. "Yeah, I miss him too. Atlas has been teaching him some bad habits." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic key attached to a simple chain. "I came to give you this." She looked at it, puzzled. "What is it?" "It's the spare for my apartment," he said. "South Boston, for you and for Scout. And Atlas when I'm gone. The place needs noise, you know? Can't have it turning into a museum." Her fingers closed around the key, the metal cold against her skin. "Dan, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "Think of it as a contingency plan. Marines like those." For a moment they stood in the soft hum of the shelter, surrounded by the quiet shuffle of dogs settling into evening. Grace looked up at him, her eyes wet but steady. "We'll keep the porch light on for you," she said. Dan smiled, the rare, unguarded kind that made the years fall away from his face. That's all a man can ask for. When he left, the doorbell's soft chime echoed after him. Atlas, waiting outside, gave a low bark of farewell before following his master into the fading sunlight. That night, as Grace locked up, she turned the key he had given her over and over in her hand. It was small, ordinary, unremarkable, but to her it was more than metal. It was a promise. Somewhere across the city, a Marine and his old dog would walk beneath the same winter stars, and a light would always wait for them, burning quietly in Cambridge. When the last snow melted from the rooftops of Boston, and the streets began to hum again with life, Grace often found herself standing by the window of the shelter at dusk. The city lights shimmered like small prayers scattered across the horizon. She would close her eyes and whisper a quiet thanks, not to luck, not to fate, but to something far greater. Because somewhere between the storm and the stillness, she had seen what people call a miracle. Not the kind written in the sky or shouted from the pulpits, but the kind that happens quietly, through ordinary hands. A soldier who stopped when no one else would. A girl who refused to look away from suffering. A dog who guarded them both when hope seemed too fragile to hold. Perhaps that's how God works in this world. Not through thunder or fire, but through the small acts of courage and love that keep the light alive. And maybe that's the message this story was always meant to tell. That miracles still happen. One rescued soul at a time. One gentle choice at a time. So tonight, as you finish this story, take a moment. Look around you. Maybe someone near you is walking through their own storm, waiting for a sign that kindness still exists. Be that sign. Offer a hand, a prayer, a bit of warmth. Because somewhere, an unseen thread connects all of us. The lost, the brave, the faithful. And through that thread, grace flows quietly like the light of dawn. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never truly gone. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, compassion, and faith. And may God bless you, the listeners, the believers, and the ones who still choose to love even after the storm.